Unit 5, Notes number 2, The Great Depression in America. So in the notes today, we'll be looking at how the Great Depression is affecting American people, how it is changing their lives. The Great Depression, a period from about 1929 to 1940 in which the U.S. economy plummeted and unemployment soared. It was caused by four main factors. Tariffs and war debts cut down the sale of U.S. exports, the farming crisis of low prices, debt, and foreclosure, the availability of easy credit throughout the 1920s, and the unequal distribution of income. So all of these factors happening together made this perfect storm, along with the Great Crash, to create the Great Depression. First, let's look at the effects in the U.S. So the banking panic. Most Americans didn't have money invested in stocks, but they did have money in banks. And so banks were brought in because many of the margin loans that were used to buy stock were not paid back once the stock market fell. So that means banks lost money. And that impacted people who had their money saved in banks, checking accounts, savings accounts. The uncertainty caused by the crash led to panic for people to withdraw their savings from banks. And so the way that banks work is that they don't always have everyone's money in the bank at one time. So if you are saving money, the bank then uses your money to then give someone a car loan, a home loan. And so this works because the idea is that no one will need their money all at the same time. But with this panic, everyone wants their savings, so they go to the banks and they withdraw the money. So the banking panic of 1929, millions rushed to banks to withdraw all of their savings at once, not just $20, $50, but they want $1,000. They want to clean out their banking account. The bank rush drained funds. Many banks failed because they couldn't cover withdrawals. So once banks ran out of money, they were closed. So it left many people without their savings. And there was no kind of insurance for it. If the bank closed, they had no other way to get their money back. So over 600 banks failed by December of 1929, so just within 2 months of the Great Crash. Millions of Americans lost their savings. And so people who had been responsible, they're conservative with their money, had nothing invested in the stock market, they were still impacted by this. So banks that had invested in stocks lost their money and failed. So you see, these pictures show people outside of banks wanting to go in, withdraw their money. Many banks, closed their doors, and so people just waited, hoping that they would reopen, and they never did. Impact on urban life. Cities were hit hard because the collapse of companies eliminated factory jobs. High unemployment in cities meant evictions, homelessness, hunger. So once people lost their job, they had no source of income. And maybe they didn't have money in banks, or they lost their savings in the banking panic. And so if you can't pay rent, you can't pay your mortgage, then you lose your house. And so homelessness was on the rise. High rates of homelessness in cities forced some to live in what was known as shanty towns. Families would live in little towns of makeshift shacks made of scrap material. The hungry and unemployed resorted to selling whatever they could to make do. So here are some pictures. The bottom shows a shanty town, and so just empty lots. People had nowhere else to go. They put together whatever material they could use to make some sort of shelter. People tried to sell their belongings, cars. Many tried to sell apples just to make some income. So relying on charity. At the outset of the Depression, there was no system of direct relief. Cash payments or food provided to the poor by the government as a safety net. Some cities offered meager relief, but it wasn't enough and was scarce. So families relied on private charities. Breadlines, long lines of poor people waiting to receive food provided by charity, or soup kitchens, shelter offering free or low-cost food. So any type of charity, people would have to rely on private charities. There was no help from the government. There was no food stamps, there was no welfare, there was no unemployment, nothing for them to, no resources from the government. So here's a picture kind of showing the irony of these people are waiting in a bread line wanting to get food, but the background shows the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. So during the Great Depression, this definitely was not true. In 1928, Americans elected Herbert Hoover to the presidency. Hoover continued the hands-off government policies of Harding and Coolidge. By 1930, with the economy crashing, America turned to Hoover for help. How Hoover would respond would come to define his presidency. So first, let's look at Hoover's philosophy. So as a result, Hoover's beliefs centered on the idea of rugged individualism. The idea that everyone should succeed through their own efforts without the aid of others. He felt that if you were able to do something on your own, you get much more satisfaction from it. He also felt that most people don't want help, that when you received help from the government or from someone else, it didn't make people feel good. So he served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. He was a vocal proponent of the pro-business small government policies. So he has this belief that government shouldn't play a big role, that people should be able to kind of tough it out and solve their own problems. And so he really didn't feel it was the government's job to solve or intervene with the Great Depression. Hoover's presidency. Hoover's legacy. His failure to act, and he's often blamed for worsening the Depression, because if he acted sooner, he possibly could have made things better. He stressed that Americans should remain optimistic while the government maintained a limited role. He opposed all forms of direct relief or federal welfare to aid citizens, again, not believing it was the government's duty to do so. He thought the government should foster cooperation between businesses and people. Hoover believed the government shouldn't force businesses to do things, but they must do it on their own. So he didn't want businesses to create laws or to force businesses to keep their staff up, keep a high wage. He thought that businesses should do that voluntarily. But of course, they're not going to do that unless they are forced to do so. So a limited response. Hoover's response to the Great Depression centered on voluntary action, the idea that businesses and people would do what was right for the economy on their own. Hoover called together business, banking, and labor leaders to discuss this. He asked them to voluntarily not fire workers, to not cut wages, not to foreclose, and not to strike. He concentrated government efforts to provide resources to charities so that they could provide relief to the needy, but it wasn't coming from the government. By 1930, the economy was in ruins, and anger in America was aimed at Hoover. Americans felt that the president wasn't leading the country in time of crisis. Desperate for help, many felt the government had failed those in need. Hoover was seen by Americans as cold and heartless and a man of privilege. And so people began to use his name to describe all of these elements of being homeless and poor. So these shanty towns became known as Hoovervilles. People often used newspapers to cover themselves. Those were Hoover blankets. People would untuck their pockets to show that they were poor. Those were Hoover flags. So this American opinion was definitely not supportive of Hoover. So too little, too late. So the Boulder Dam. Hoover authorized the construction of the Boulder Dam on the Colorado River, a public works project that created thousands of jobs, electric power, and water supply for the region. There was the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. This law lowered mortgage rates and let farmers refinance their loans, and it helped keep Americans in their homes. There was also the Refinance Corporation. This bailout provided $2 billion for banks and businesses to keep them afloat. So he began to authorize these things, but again, it wasn't direct aid to the people. It was helping banks, it was helping businesses. He did create the Public Works Project, but again, only a small number of people that were directly working on it would have benefited. And so many people felt it was too little, too late. So these are the end of the notes. You want to make sure you're keeping up to date with your key terms. And then we'll have 2 more sets of notes next week.